Today I'm going to walk you through how to measure for benign and malignant skin lesion excisions in CPT. I talked in my prior video about math and medical coding, which you can check out right here, how there are certain sections of CPT and HCPCS where you do have to do a little bit of basic math. The integumentary section in CPT is definitely a good one for math because you have to calculate things like skin grafts and rotation of flaps and lesions. And they can be a little bit tricky depending on the way that providers document them. So I'm actually going to show you a couple different examples of ways you may see it documented by providers, and then stick around because we're going to go through a case study. So when we're coding for these skin lesion codes, our 11400 through 11646 codes in CPT, there's a couple of steps you have to follow. So first, they have to be a skin lesion. They can't be something that is generated in the subcutaneous tissue, a subcutaneous tumor. We're talking about skin lesions. So things like benign nevi, actinic keratoses, seborrheic keratoses, basal cell carcinomas, squamous cell carcinomas, those would fall into these code ranges because they are lesions that generate in the skin. So it's a skin lesion, and the documentation has to support that it was a full thickness, so through the dermis, excision. The lesion actually has to be measured prior to excision, so we can't use pathology reports for coding purposes because that pathology report size isn't taken prior to it being excised. In order to get the size that we use for our code selection, we have to take the widest diameter of the lesion plus the narrowest margin. And with these 114 through 116 series codes in CPT, a single layer closure is included. So if they are doing sutures and it's just one layer on like the dermis, that's included. We don't bill out separately for that. We only bill out separately if it is a 2-layer closure or a complex closure. So intermediate complex closures can be coded separately, but not those simple 1-layer closures. It's understood that you're going to do at least a 1-layer closure if you are excising a lesion, so that's bundled into that code. Now, all the guidelines you need are in CPT. So you can see here, excision is defined as a full thickness through the dermis, removal of the lesion, including the margins, and it includes that simple non-layered closure. We report each one separately. And it says code selection is determined by measuring the greatest clinical diameter of the lesion plus the narrowest margins. So most narrow margins. And they show you diagrams here in the CPT book, so familiarize yourself with those. And here's where it says the measurement of the lesion plus the margins is made prior to the excision. So that's why we can't use the path report for sizing, because path reports are not measurements made prior to excision per the CPT definition here. Now down in this section it talks about the closure, but I actually have a whole separate video about coding for closures and laceration repairs. You can check that one out here. So let's say I've got a lesion and it's kind of asymmetrical. So here's my little lumpy lesion, and we're going to excise it this way. So the provider is going to make an ellipse, and then they're going to pull these two sides and suture them back in together this way. So there's just kind of like one incision line, kind of like this, once they suture it back together. So how we would measure this is we would take the widest area of the lesion. So let's say this lesion is here. It's 2.5, and here is 2. So of the lesion, which is the bigger number? Bigger number is the 2.5. That's what we're taking for the lesion. And then for the margins, we need the smaller number. So this one, we'll say this here is maybe 3. So here is the 3 centimeter margin. But this margin from here to here is smaller. It's only like 1 centimeter. So in that case, we're taking the smaller number. So for the size of this lumpy lesion here that we're excising, we take the bigger number. For the margins, we take the smaller number. Sometimes the provider will only give you one margin size. Sometimes they don't. We'll look at a couple of examples. But in this one, we're going to say that this is an oblong lesion, and this one's 2.5 is our bigger, and 1 centimeter is our margin. So we're going to have our big lesion size here, our biggest number, 2.5, big lesion number, small margin number. So our smallest margin number is 1 centimeter. But do we just have 1 centimeter? We have another centimeter over here, right? So we added on 2 for this margin here and this margin here. So 1 centimeter plus 1 centimeter. So the code selection size that we're going to use, 2.5 plus 1 plus 1, 2, 3, 4.5. And that's the size that we're going to code off of. So that's the size we use for our code selection. So for example, if we're back over here with our benign lesions, let's say this is one of the trunk, and we're going to go with our benign trunk lesion. We're going to code it by 4.5 centimeters because that's what we have there. So here is our trunk, arms, and legs. This one's 0.5, and then they get bigger. So 0.6 to 1, 1.1 to 2, 2.1 to 3, 3.1 to 4, and then here's where we are. We're over 4 centimeters. So this would be a 11406 if it was a lesion of the trunk. Now, unlike laceration repairs, we don't combine sizes for lesions. We code them each individually. So say here on my arm, I've got a lesion here that's 2 centimeters and here that's 2 centimeters. This is one code for the 2 centimeter lesion. This is one code for the 2 centimeter lesion. We don't code that as a 4 centimeter total lesion. Now you might have one that's a perfect circle, that it's just this completely round lesion and round excised diameter as well. So let's say this is just 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter, and this margin here is a 0.5. So we take our 1 centimeter plus our 0.5 plus our 0.5, because we have margins on each side. We have a 0.5 here, we have a 0.5 here. So that equals 2. So again, that's the size that we use to code off of. You may see providers document this a few different ways. So here's a couple of examples of some things that you might see when you're looking at provider documentation. So this provider said they did the excision and it was 1.2 by 1.3 and the margins were 3 millimeters. So we have to convert that millimeters to centimeters. So a 3 millimeter would be a 0.3 centimeter. So we're going to take our bigger number here for our lesion, because this is our lesion size, 1.2 by 1.5, which is bigger, 1.5. Now here they're just giving us this 3 millimeter. So we're going to assume that that's 0.3 on both sides, that everything is equal at 0.3. So we would take our 1.5 plus our 0.3 plus another 0.3, which would give us 2.1 centimeters. 10 millimeters is the equivalent of 1 centimeter. If you're ever struggling with converting millimeters to centimeters, don't be ashamed into going into Google and looking up a converter tool and having it convert for you. Now this one, we have, the provider just said their final defect size, not ideal. Not ideal, because we want to know the total lesion plus the margins. Now I've had some providers tell me that if they're 100% positive that it is a benign lesion, they will just not take margins. They're just going to take one ellipse and that's it. So we could maybe assume that that's what this provider did in this scenario, and in that case we would just code it based off of that 1.8 widest defect. Kind of a similar situation too here. I've seen this before with providers. I would certainly make that an educational point for them, but typically when I see something that just says 2.0 centimeters, the providers usually mean that that is 2 centimeters by 2 centimeters. So in that case, we could assume that it's the 2 centimeter and code it just based off of 2 centimeters. But again, I would just encourage educating your providers, if you see documentation like this, that the coding is based off of the size of the lesion plus the narrowest margin. So you need the lesion size and the margin size, and then actually the closure size separate as well. In some of the coding exams, like for example, my COC, I had a couple of questions that were multiple lesions excised and by different methods, which made it really handy to have different colored highlighters available to highlight which sizes were for which lesions and which method of removal. But if we look at this sample here, we have a enlarging skin neoplasm, actinic neoplasm, left upper cheek. It measures 1 centimeter by 1.5 centimeter, and enlarging 0.5 by 1 nevus of the left lower cheek neck region. Same thing for post-op. And then if we look down here, they have the closures, but we don't have margin sizes. So in the absence of margin sizes, you could maybe make a company policy that says, hey, this is what we do. If there's no margin, we're just going to assume there were no margins because they're not documented, and we're just going to code it to just the size of the lesion or the size of the defect that was provided. But maybe we could find it down here in the body of the note. So if we can scan here and find the margins, that would be great. But as we're kind of looking through that, you can see here patient was prepped and evaluated, etc., etc. And here's where he actually starts describing the procedure. I began excising the left upper cheek and left lower cheek neck lesions as listed above. These were excised with a blade. The left upper cheek lesion measures 1 centimeter by 1.5. After excision, it was 1.5 by 1.8. Okay, so now we can kind of see here he did take margins. So this was the size of the lesion, 1 centimeter by 1.5 centimeter, and then after the margins were taken, it was 1.5 plus 1.8, which means he took a 0.5 on this side, and then 1.5, and then the difference from 1.8 is 0.3. So out of these, we have our widest area, narrowest margin would be the 0.3, so we would have our 1.8 cm would be the size for coating. And then it talks about how it could be an actinic keratosis, possible basal cell carcinoma. They did wide undermining, and there was a layered closure, so the left upper neck was removed, similar matter. Blade defect was 1 centimeter by 1.5, and then they just didn't state anything about the after, the size before and size after. So 1 centimeter by 1.5 after wide underminings were performed. So it sounds like maybe they actually did wide underminings. That to me would indicate a complex closure, and a 2-layer plastic closure was performed. So here you're saying 1 centimeter by 1.5, and actually as we look here, this was the size of the lesion prior to excision, so 0.5 by 1, and then this was the total defect size. So we have this and we have this. So the nevus, the largest size was 1 centimeter, right? And then we have our margins here. So it would have been, the difference was 0.5 and then 0.5 here. So it looks like he took 0.5 on each side, because the difference between the 0.5 and the 1 is 0.5. Difference between 1 and 1.5 is 0.5. So that would be the 1.5 size that we're using, because this is our widest area, narrowest margin, 1.5. So this one we would code by 1.8. This one we would code by our 1.5 centimeter skin lesion. Now this one I might query the provider for a handful of things on, because first off he's saying cheek neck, and those are 2 different CPT codes. Now I'm thinking more so neck, because here he's saying it's upper neck. This one is definitely cheek. But the other thing we have to look at is, we talked about how those closures, when we're billing them out separately, for the 2-layer closures, we need a size. 1-layer closures are included, but this looks like it was at least an intermediate closure, because it was 2 layers. The other one had wide undermining, so that actually is a complex closure, but we don't have any sizes of those closures. So we can't assume that the closure was the same size as the lesion. Because if we look just at the other one that we did, look, let's go back. Like, this closure length is going to be way different than the size of the lesion, or the size of the lesion plus the narrowest margins, right? So that's why this has to be documented separately. We can't just assign the size of the closure that's going to be done by pulling these, 2 ends together and making this long suture line. We can't assume what that size is. The provider has to document it, and there's no length of closure here. So I would definitely be communicating with this provider in regards to the length of the closure, and possibly clarifying, was this really cheek or neck? So I would definitely have some conversations with this provider, but let's say these came back benign, and we're going to do cheek 1.8, we're going to do neck 1.5. So cheek is under this one, excision, other benign lesion including margins except skin tag. Face, ears, eyelids, nose, lips, mucous membrane. So the cheek is on the face, and this is a 1.8. So we're going to code it to the 11442, because that's for the excise diameter 1.1 to 2.0, and 1.8 is right in that range there. So 11442. And then we have the excision of the neck, 1.5. That's a different section here. So here we have excision, scalp, neck, hands, feet. And then we want to look for the right side. So we have 0.5 or less, 0.6 to 1, 1.1 to 2.0. And what was this again? 1.5? Yeah, so that would fall in this one here, the 11422. So you can see if it's the cheek or the neck, we're going to land on two different codes. So we want to make sure that that is really the neck with the provider. With skin lesion coding, the reason it breaks down by different regions is because of complexity. So something that's on the trunk or the arms are going to have a relatively same complexity versus something that's on your eyelid. And also it changes by sizes because, you know, if I'm having a 1 centimeter lesion removed off of my arm, I'm not going to be too concerned. If I'm having a 1 centimeter lesion removed off of my cheek, that's a lot more concerning, right? That's more complex. This is a lot more soft, delicate tissue on the cheek. Eyelids, definitely, for sure. So there are additional RVUs, additional reimbursements for if the lesion is wider, if the lesion is in a more sensitive area. And also check because there are some anatomic locations like eyelids and lips and genitalia where they may have specific types of lesion codes. Actually, if you want to learn more about lesions, I do have an hour-long webinar you can purchase on my website, contempocoding.com, called Let's Talk Lesions. It'll talk about all the different types of lesion coding, shaves, lipomas, biopsies, all the difference in those. And you can buy that on contempocoding.com and get 1 CEU if you're AAPC certified. And I'll give you 20% off if you use my code Lesion20. So check it out. It is a great resource. Very, very helpful. So that's it for those skin lesion codes. Again, they have to be full thickness through the dermis. You need the biggest size of the lesion plus the smallest size of the margins, and a simple 1-layer closure is included, but you can code separately for the intermediate and complex closure codes. If you want to know more about closures, this is the video here that you want to check out. I will see you guys in the next video, and until then, just keep on coding on.